Okay, good evening, everybody. This is Chair Greg Hooksma of the Gig Harbor Planning Commission, Thursday, October 7th. It's 5 p.m. and I'm calling the meeting to order. First, let's have roll call. Commissioner Soltis.
Here.
Commissioner Bradbury.
Here.
Commissioner Krasik.
Here.
Commissioner Bennett.
Here.
Commissioner Greina.
Here.
Commissioner Brown. Looks like Commissioner Brown will be joining us later, so we'll make a note of it when he joins the meeting, if you would please, Michelle.
Thank you.
And then we have a familiar face from the city, Katrina Knudsen.
I'm here.
And Michelle Thomas, of course.
Always here.
And then some folks I don't know yet. I see Dawn Couch. Hi, Dawn. And Andrew Bjorn. So I presume they will find out later about how they fit into the puzzle.
They are consultants assisting us with the UGA analysis, so they're for the second item.
Okay. Okay. So first order of business is approval of the minutes from our September 16th meeting.
So moved.
I second.
We have a move and a second. Is there any discussion or corrections for the minutes?
I have to abstain, Greg, because I wasn't here for the meeting.
Okay. All right. Hearing none other than all those in favor say aye.
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 That's a unanimous aye. So the motion is approved. Okay, moving on to the first agenda item we're going to have the Arts and Culture Study session, and welcome Katrina. It's glad to have you. I want to say filling in for Carl, but I dare say that since you're his boss. So.
That's okay. I was going to say pinch hitting. Fun.
No, it's nice to see you again.
Thank you, you too. You ready to go?
Yes, and if everybody could mute their microphones, I would appreciate it.
All right. Michelle, I see that Charlie Glock Jackson is in the attendees section for the commissioners. Charlie Glock Jackson is the chair of the Gig Harbor Arts Commission. And with your permission, I'd like to admit her to the panelist side to, if you have questions pertaining to goals and policies, then you could ask at that point. Is that acceptable?
Yes.
Okay. So we will admit her. Okay, great. So commissioners, thanks for having me this evening. We have an exciting agenda item. It's been a long time coming from the arts community, and it is the potential addition of an arts and culture element to our comprehensive plan. I know that Principal Planner Carl DeSimas has briefed you on this prior. I'll give a little bit of background again and for the record. And then depending on what the chair and commission would like, we could go through the goals and policies that are proposed in the draft chapter. This work session is in advance of the October 21st public hearing with the Planning Commission. So at that meeting, the public will be asked to come and testify to the commission regarding the element for things that they like, things that they don't like. Well, there might not be any of that, Charlie. Or things that they would like to see changed. And after that public hearing, we will then request the Planning Commission to deliberate and formulate a recommendation to council, which could be sending the document as is, or you could, as a commission, request for changes to be made within your recommendation to the council, and then that would be sent forward. As you probably know, City of Gig Harbor, within the city, the Arts Commission is very active, and we have a very active arts community that provides a civic nature to all of us that live here. And the arts have been supported in the community for more than 20 years. They're facilitating visual arts and expression, literary, celebration of community, etc. In 2012, the Arts Commission was successful in having arts-related policy language put into the parks chapter of the comprehensive plan. And what that helped to do is facilitate public art at park projects that were being either new parks or renovated parks within the city system, that art would be a component of those projects. The Arts Commission, again, being a very active organization, they proposed elevating arts out of the parks chapter and into its own element. Within that, a caveat that there are many required chapters within our city's comprehensive plan for the Growth Management Act. Arts and culture is not one of them. However, we are not prohibited from the Growth Management Act from having an additional chapter such as the arts and culture element. So there's not a legal reason why the city should not have this. It's something that we can do. In 2018, the purpose of the text amendment to change the comp plan was to delineate the importance of the arts, visual, music, theater, dance, poetry, film, and other creative endeavors as they relate to quality of life in Gig Harbor. And that has been a primary objective of the Arts Commission and the arts community, is to delineate how arts and culture influence Gig Harbor and kind of what that means, and how we should kind of further that within our community through the comp plan. The Arts Commission supported their request in 2018 from a survey that was administered in 2017 that was provided as a link to your packet. They received more than 900 responses to that and gave feedback from being essential, that needs and desires differ, arts and culture activities offer positive experiences, that activities are important, and that spaces and facilities for the arts are also important. And that survey response was translated into some of the language that is before you this evening. Within this, the Arts Commission conducted some additional outreach, not just the survey, including phone conversations and workshops. And some of the things that are issues that this chapter plans to address is the I can't say this word, no, I can't even say it. It's on page 3 of the memo, but it's how we can integrate the arts into our everyday policy actions at the city. And so typically there is not a requirement outside of maybe a 1% for the arts to have for public projects to have kind of a requirement for a city to look regularly at arts and culture. And that's really what this plan is attempting to do, is make it a regular thought within city government about the arts in decisions that we make regularly. So how can we put that into our operational documents? How can they create and cultivate supportive partnerships, noting that the Arts Commission won't be able to do this alone. Funding will be necessary, and partnerships within the community will be vital and necessary in order to make this chapter a reality. So the recommendations for the commission, and as we move into the public hearing, the structure, this would be proposed to be a new chapter 14 within the comprehensive plan. So again, this chapter does not currently exist. We would be adding it to the existing comprehensive plan as chapter 14. The chapter as it's proposed to the commission at this point is consistent with how the comprehensive plan, the structure of the current comprehensive plan that was adopted in 2015. So you'll see that it doesn't take any creative liberties to make it prettier or kind of more innovative. Those are things that as staff, we plan to work with the commission on our 2024 periodic update in order to make it more action oriented, make it look a little more lively, kind of less of a plan that's going to sit on a shelf. So although the arts and culture, wanted to provide, it would be nice to provide an arts and culture chapter that looks artsy. At this point, we didn't take or allow for that kind of creative license. It will match the format of the rest of the plan at this point. Again, that could change in 2024. The proposed policies generally reflect the Arts Commission's recommendations with slight modifications to assist in and ensure internal consistency with the plan. That's very similar to the structure. So we wanted to make sure that, you know, some of the nomenclature was similar between chapters. So it wasn't that you're reading the land use chapter and the environment chapter, and then you get to chapter 14 and it was something written totally different. So we've crafted it with the Arts Commission original proposal in mind, but did change it for internal consistency purposes a little bit. And I believe those are the end of my introductory remarks. Chair, there was the draft chapter 14 element, and we can go through that page by page or go question by question, whatever your desire.
What would y'all like to do? You all being commissioners.
And also, if there are no questions at this point, it is not a bad thing to send it forward to hearing. So we don't have to have questions for questions' sake. You could send it to hearing on the 21st and then see what the public says, and then have additional deliberations at that point as well.
Hey, Greg, I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
I was just kind of wondering about some of the wording. It implies, at least to me, maybe I'm jumping ahead, but it implies that there's a block of funding that's going to be coming from the city at some period downstream of some magnitude to support the arts and get matches and grants and things like that. That's one question, really, Katrina. Is that something you would typically put in a comprehensive plan? And am I misreading this section a little bit?
No, there is definitely language in here that assumes that funding is going to be available. That's something that the Arts Commission is currently working on with the City Council through the budgeting process to ensure that they have money to do some of the items that are necessary in this chapter. And within the comp plan, it is, although again, not for arts and culture typically, because this isn't a typical comp plan chapter. However, within the comp plan, it is the appropriate place to put in aspirational needs and potential funding as well. And I'm sorry, I'm seeing Robin is also on the attendee side, and she is the co-chair of the Arts Commission. So with the commission's permission, we can transfer her over to the panelist side as well.
Sure.
Okay.
I guess I have a very general question.
Larry, before you do that, could I ask Charlie and Robin to turn your video on?
Hi.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Maybe Charlie stepped away from her computer.
No, I'm here.
Oh,
Charlie is here, but I've been having trouble with my video. Let me try again. I may just be the faceless voice, for which I apologize. I had video a little while ago, and somehow it got turned off. So
yeah, we did see briefly.
yeah, I am here, and I'm somehow not able to get it to come back.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
My apologies.
All right, Larry, go ahead with your question.
Reading through the material and listening to what Katrina has to say, I am not understanding what the potential benefit would be for adding this chapter. The language that I was reading, frankly, seemed to be extremely vague and kind of altruistic. It didn't provide anything on which decision makers could effectively evaluate some of the proposals that would be put before them. So I do not see it as a natural fit to move it essentially from parks into the comprehensive plan. So if somebody could help me understand that a little better, I'd appreciate that.
I think Commissioner Bradbury, with having the plan, one of the major reasons for that was, again, to put it in the minds of the city regularly. So when we're making decisions on various items such as parks, city buildings, et cetera, we do have that that lens available to us. Additionally, with the goals and policies as they're drafted, the Arts Commission can use those in crafting their annual work plans that, again, would receive buy-in from council. So it could help to craft those work plans.
I would also add, this is Robin Ovney, Vice Chair, and I'm sorry, they're doing our lawn outside. But such is from life from home. I would say that what you are seeing now in the comp plan got greatly reduced from the what the broader plan was, and they streamlined a lot of the language that had some more specifics in it. So if there's any way that we'd be happy to share with you the larger plan that we wrote. It's not huge, but it has a little more detail.
And Robin, the commission has access to that was provided in the link. And I did describe why the purpose for the streamlined approach, I think, prior to you entering the meeting.
Mr. Chair, I see this, having it in the comprehensive plan as a way of elevating the arts in importance in terms of the city decision maker and in terms of the overall planning for the city. So we may be looking at things that encouraging businesses and shopping centers when they go through to start including arts. I think there was some statements in there about setting aside a certain percentage of the building costs. I think it's 1% for the arts is the term of art that's used there, pardon the pun. So I think the important thing is just to get it up there as something that's that the city sees as very important.
Thank you very much. This is Charlie talking. Commissioner Kroswick, am I saying that right? I'm sorry.
It's Krozik.
Krozik. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. That you put it very well, and I appreciate that that reasoning.
I would also add, I wanted to mention, I also sit on the Washington State Arts Commission, and we're doing our strategic planning now as well for the next few years. And one of the main pillars that we see for the arts for any city or for the state is that it's an economic driver. And if it's raised as a priority by the community itself, that enhances and also rolls over into making it more of an economic driver overall. And I can also, if you're interested, provide some state statistics for how much of the economy itself is actually driven by the arts and culture. And while we don't have a major theater in this, a performing theater, we have a lot of other arts activities that take place in this city that drive commerce, including everything from the shopping on Main Street to restaurants and venues where entertainment is experienced.
So having said that, and actually, as you were talking, I thought, I would be interested in seeing the data of, how does this drive economic activity? I mean, I certainly, theoretically, I appreciate that if you have an arts festival in downtown Gig Harbor, it's going to generate money for somebody. So, so it seems to be working pretty well right now. I don't see any lack of interest or lack of importance. I see arts holding a very important position in the city of Gig Harbor already. So given that, and I'm not anti-art, I'm just trying to kind of follow on with Commissioner Bradbury to have this make sense why we're taking this unusual step. If things seem to be working well already, and so part of the motivation of my question is, what additional cost is this going to incur for the city with regards to staffing, to support? I mean, is it just a piece of paper, you know, a chapter in the book? Does something else change having this as a separate chapter in the comprehensive plan? Can you just help me understand the other side of the economics? What are the economic costs to the city of Gig Harbor by doing this, if we were to do this?
Well, Charlie, you chime in here too, but I guess I would say that the costs are the same as what they are now. We want to continue maintaining our programs. The 1% for art is something that we wanted to explore. That is not part of what you're voting on. That would not happen right away for new building projects. It's just pretty much standard in the state, as well as Pierce County, that of the 1% for art, but that is something we wanted to explore. That's not something that you're voting on at this time. But what I will say is we want to maintain the budget, but the same budget that we have now. We hope it will increase over time, of course, like everybody. But the main thing is that it will help elevate the arts, and it will help elevate the commitment to arts and culture. Every other major city in this area has a cultural plan that is included as a separate element, a cultural element in their plan. And we referenced many of them when we wrote this plan and started writing it many years ago. So we are talking about, cities like not just Seattle, but small cities that are comparable in size, that have a cultural plan and that have it as part of a cultural element in their planning. Charlie, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I would say that among those cities are Bainbridge Island, Paulsbo, Olympia, which is bigger than Gig Harbor, of course, but Wenatchee has one. Edmonds has recently added an arts and culture element to their comprehensive plan. So it's not at all without precedent.
Or Townsend,
yes.
Aberdeen.
Right. There are numerous cities, and in our preliminary research, we got in touch with many of those cities, and for guidance and just to kind of pick their brains on how did they go about it, why it's important to them, and so forth. So there is significant support statewide in other jurisdictions for arts and culture elements in comprehensive plans.
So Chair, of course, we will have the public hearing on the 21st and then ask the commission to make a recommendation to council. And this will be one of the key elements of a recommendation is, does the commission believe that it needs to be and should be a chapter within the comprehensive plan or not? And if you do, does it want to proceed as drafted, or are there amendments to that?
And if I might add, one of our motivations for this proposed element, as you know, currently there is an arts and culture reference in the PROS plan. We feel very, very strongly that art is much more than statues and parks. Art is music and theater and dance, poetry, prose. We are surrounded by art in every part of our daily life. The coffee cup that you're drinking from was designed by someone. That's art. The chair that you're sitting in was designed by someone. That's art. Architecture is art. The arts are so broad and influential and important in our lives that we feel that it's time for Gig Harbor to recognize that and make a statement that yes, the arts matter in Gig Harbor, and the city of Gig Harbor supports them.
Chair Hoeksema, just for the sake of process, it is not typical for us to have the applicant speaking at the work session stage. So although they are responding now, that is again with the commission's permission. This is generally for the commission to ask questions. The applicant, who is the Arts Commission, will have an opportunity in the public hearing to address the commission for longer than 3 minutes. They'll get 5 minutes as the applicant. And at that point in time, the commission can also direct questions toward the applicant as well as city staff.
Okay. Thanks for that reminder. So is there, and maybe you're going to get to it, but is there a cost to the city to do this?
The city already has staff support for the Arts Commission. It's hard to note at this point if that will, if this element will see an increase in need for staff. As I mentioned, the Arts Commission does have a budget that the council appropriates each year, and they make budget requests and then the council deliberates. So there is a set of funding, but that is a policy decision from the council. If this element were not to be in the comp plan, that process would still continue. So the city, I believe, would still have the discussion and still fund art regardless of this chapter. And again, the city does have, does staff the Arts Commission. So there is, again, some staff level to that. It's hard to know if that would increase with the element.
Thanks.
Oh, another question, if I may, Greg, to Katrina. Katrina, did you and Carl or your staff do any kind of serious scrub of the words to kind of get it into the traditional comp plan format?
So noting that this is an application, this is not a city, this is not my department's proposal. We gave you the original draft that was provided to us from the Arts Commission in your packet. The chapter as is right now has been put into the format of the rest of the comprehensive plan. So the words have not been, staff did not go over and change the words to anything that we would feel more appropriate. The words generally are as provided to us by the application.
Okay, so you reformatted, but you didn't actually edit basically the verbiage. Just
That's correct. And recall, we edited the format to make it consistent with the rest of the comp plan. If this does become part of the comprehensive plan as chapter 14, as in preparation again for the 2024 update, as I mentioned earlier, there could be some more creative license in terms of photos. Our current comprehensive plan does not have photos in it, does not have a lot of maps or charts. That those could be added in this element as well next time, as well as what we'd like to do is institute an implementation component to each chapter so that we have near, mid, and long-term goals. And that's something that I believe the commission would like to have implementation as part of this element. However, we don't have implementation in the rest of the comp plan. So at this point, what we're proposing is a format that's similar to all the rest of the chapters so that when you're reading them, they're consistent from one to the next.
Thank you.
I would add a comment that what I see in the application materials is an inclusion of what we would call physical arts like architecture or visual arts that might be incorporated into some aspect of a building or a park setting, as opposed to performing or activity type arts that just don't seem to have a direct fit with the Planning Commission or even city council activities. Those kinds of performing activities might require approvals, but there are processes in place for that. And those are generally activities that are driven by the proponents of those activities. So I'm having a disconnect here with the proposed chapter 14 and the specific charters of the Planning Commission.
So without speaking for the applicants, the comprehensive plan does have a capital component to it. And typically that's for wastewater, stormwater, transportation, et cetera, where we do a short-term 6-year plan for all projects that are required to meet concurrency, as well as a long-term plan or 20-year plan of costs in order to keep up with growth. I'm not saying that is proposed in this plan right now. However, you are correct that typically, and especially in traditionally within Gig Harbor, performing arts have been, a private enterprise. If this element does become part of the comprehensive plan, and if there is political support, let's say for a performing arts center down the road, this could be the basis for such a capital expenditure discussion in the future. It is not currently, so I want to make that clear. But that capital component, if that were to be put in the comprehensive plan, it could be utilized for grants, for endowments, things like that, and also could be utilized for long-term city budgeting purposes.
So I guess I'm still a little bit fuzzy like Larry. Would the adoption of this as an independent chapter, what are the future implications of that? Would it tie the city's hands and compel them to do something that is not currently being contemplated? I mean, what are the unintended consequences of adopting this as an independent chapter? That's the gist of my question.
As written, it would not obligate. It is more, again, aspirational, putting arts in the city's regular sphere of thinking. So when the city's making decisions, I believe what this plan is asking us to do is consider the arts and work towards putting it into more of our everyday lives. As currently written, the goals and policies, it would not require the city to do anything. However, in the future, if this is added to the comp plan through the 2024 update, there could be some additional teeth put in here. In particular, when we start talking about implementation, if the city goes for more aspirational goals to actionable items, those are things that the city could be held to achieve as part of the 20-year plan. As currently written, it's again more aspirational in nature, and I think maybe setting a foundation for some future work. And Robin, if you could send what you put in the chat to Michelle Thomas, then we can ensure that that is sent formally to the commissioners. That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions at this point?
I also have some other economic information I could send as well that I'll include to Michelle.
Yeah, that'd be great. As part of public comment, you can submit anything that you would like, and we'll ensure that it's passed on to the commissioners.
Okay. Well, thanks for the brief, Katrina, and appreciate the clarification on the questions that the commissioners had, and certainly appreciate both Charlie and Robin coming this evening and help us understand how we're moving forward on this.
And
Well, thank
Shirley and Robin, again, you'll have 5 minutes combined as the Arts Commission to discuss your proposal post-public hearing. And the commissioners will be able to direct questions to you after that as well.
Okay, so we'll have something with the planning with you all again. Where we'll
Yes.
present. And
Yeah, on
then,
the 21st, there'll be a public hearing.
okay, great, it's on the calendar.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we very much appreciate your inviting us to this and very much look forward to pleading our case further on the 21st.
Yes, and we'll follow proper protocols, of course.
Right,
As
yeah.
opposed to now.
Thank you. Thank you for letting us,
Thank you.
thank you for letting us sort of break the rules a little bit. We're artists after all.
Okay. All right, well, let's maybe we can remove Charlie and Robin as panelists at this point.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Any other discussion or questions by any of the commissioners before we move on to the next agenda item?
Yeah, I was just wondering if their case would be made stronger if somehow they crisped up their proposed element language to, get some of the fuzziness out of there and get a little more specific. I think that's maybe part of Larry's problem. It is, artistically aspirationally, and it's not as concrete as some of the other things we might have normally been used to seeing. I don't know, are they already kind of locked on this particular set of language, Katrina?
This is the language that they put forward, again, for your consideration. The commission as a whole, what we'll ask you to do is put forward a recommendation to council. And so that could be going through line by line and kind of underline strikeout of language. So if the commission wants it to be more action oriented through the deliberation process, we can go through, each goal and policy and craft that as per the planning commission's recommendation, if that's the desire of the commission.
Okay.
Yeah,
Did that answer your question? I feel like I was clear, but then not clear at the same time.
I think you were clear with me. I think if we chose to do so, we could, after the public hearing, as part of our submission to the council, submit a plan with some red lines that we propose to it.
Yes. Yeah, the recommendation, it could even be so far as that this shouldn't be part of the comprehensive plan. That could be the commission's recommendation. I'm not saying that it will be, but it's really, you can say forward on as is, make changes to it, or not forward it on, are really the full scope of what you'll be asked to look at and the considerations that can be made.
Well, one of the things for me is we're working on behalf of the council, and so I'm wondering what it is that we're fixing by putting something forward to the council that is, as I mentioned earlier, seems to me that arts are recognized. We have a broad swath of arts going on within the community. And I'm not seeing in my current life of living in Gig Harbor a lack of emphasis being placed on the arts. So again, my bottom line is, what is it we're fixing by doing this? We're creating work for us and in the future, because you're adding something to the comprehensive plan that's going to have to be reviewed. and staffed and so on. But I mean, we have a job to do, so that's fine. But I don't get it.
Well, it's here because the council directed it to you through the docketing process. And some of this discussion that you're having right now was also had by council during the docketing hearing. There were some that did not think that this should go forward, and there were others that thought that this should go forward. So I think the questions that you're wrestling with are very relevant and germane to the discussion, quite frankly. And as I mentioned, it's not a requirement of the Growth Management Act. So, we're really looking for the Planning Commission to weigh in on, whether or not it should fit into the comprehensive plan. And if yes, then how?
No, I agree with Greg. We'll just have to see where it goes. I don't see the benefit of it now, and I'm certainly not comfortable with the proposed language if we were to recommend that an arts and culture provision be put into Chapter 14.
Commissioner Bennett and Commissioner Griner, what are your thoughts at this moment?
Go ahead, Amanda.
Okay. I'm kind of on the fence. Like, I understand the purpose of why they've brought it forward, but I also am a little on the confused side in terms of what the action items are. I'm definitely more of an action-oriented person, and what this means in terms of planning and what that means for the future and how this services the city. So I feel like it could be a language thing, or is it really even a necessity thing? And so I think it's something that I'd like to look a little bit more at. And I'd be also, and I feel like we say this with most of our projects that we work on, but I would love to see what the other cities have done, if they're using language that's similar to other cities, or do other cities have language that has a little bit more of an action-oriented side to things, and that could actually provide something for the future, or some methodology for when something does come to the future. Because I understand that it could be preparation, and this could save us in the future if something comes in that we need to have something to work with. But right now, if that doesn't exist and we're not sure what that is, it's very unclear as to how we would phrase it at this point.
And I find myself in the same position, kind of on the fence. I'm curious, how common is it for a group to present something like this? I mean, it seems a little like that's not the norm way things are done, but I'm fairly new on this group. So am I misinterpreting that?
I have been in long range planning for a very long time, not to age myself, but at least 16 years. This would be the first time that I've worked on a new element that was not a required element of the comp plan or a typical chapter. So the little bit of confusion that has been happening this evening, because this is in a required comprehensive plan document, we're required to do that, right, for the Growth Management Act. This is not a required chapter. So it's fitting something that's not required in a required element. And although it is allowed, it's again up to ultimately the city council, but with your input, whether or not this kind of rises to the level of being included in that required document or not. Some of the cities that, and Michelle, could you please make a note for when Carl's back, we can get some of those other chapters to the commission. There, some of the other cities do have performing arts centers and things of that nature that would, necessitate a capital budget that should be looked at in terms of the comp plan. So in some instances, there may be more of a nexus than what we're seeing right now in our community.
A couple of examples come to my mind. we can think of a place like Leavenworth where perhaps they've included something in their comp plan about architectural standards so that they could get to that Bavarian kind of community image. Or you can think of some place like Ashland, Oregon, that has very much gone into supporting the performing arts. So unless Gig Harbor were wanting to pursue a direction like that to change the character of the community, I am just not seeing how this would improve our current processes of the inclusion of the arts in city planning and activities. And I can certainly see with the language that's very aspirational now, that this board would have an awful lot of time consumed deciding what is or is not art, whether it's appropriate, does it meet certain goals or objectives, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I believe that those are all really good questions that can be addressed to the applicant post the public hearing. And again, I just want to reiterate that this discussion that you're having right now as commissioners is similar to discussions that were held by council as well. So I think it's very relevant.
Okay. Well, unless somebody has a new and different point, I think we've covered all the bases here perhaps, but so why don't we move on to the second agenda item and the study session 2 of the urban growth area analysis.
Great. I will hand it over to Andrew and Dawn from Burke, who are excellent consultants that are leading us through this analysis, and we look forward to their presentation.
Hey, one quick thing, would I be able to share my screen right now? Is that okay? Great. Okay, so hopefully that is coming through for everyone and is, okay, perfect.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for having us. We're really excited to have, it's our first opportunity to come and talk with you about annexation. I know you've had conversations with staff in the past. I'm just going to introduce myself. I'm Dawn Couch. I'm assisting the analytic team with conversations like this and some of the other communications pieces. And Andrew is going to do the bulk of the presentation tonight. He's the lead analyst and kind of the project manager on this. So he's also driving the PowerPoint. So next slide, Andrew. All right. And so Andrew, I'm going to turn it over here, and then I'll jump back at the end for the discussion.
Okay, great. What we're looking to present to you today is a high-level summary of the research that we've done to date. We also want to cover a few of the topics that I think that Carl had discussed with you at the previous meeting where this came up. But primarily, what we're looking at the end of this is guidance for the development of annexation guidelines for Gig Harbor, for looking at the urban growth areas that are surrounding the city and determining guidance for council in the future about if residents are looking to be brought into the city, or if the city is looking to annex certain areas, what would be some of the considerations that would need to be made. So I'll hand it over to you, Dawn, for the discussion questions.
So this is not the end of the analysis. We're in the very preliminary phases. So there's a couple steps in the process, and we're with you today just on the UGA profile. We've done a number of annexation studies at different types of communities across the state. And what we found that makes them most useful is that they're very tailored to the community. And so in a lot of ways right now, there's no annexation proposal before you or the council. And so you're trying to think forward and anticipate what is the information we would like to know when those proposals, if they should come in. So we're going to present, we've sent in the packet some preliminary analysis. Andrew's going to kind of walk through some of that. And at the end of the presentation, these are our discussion questions. And these really inform the draft materials that you've reviewed for this meeting to make those tailored and best fit the decision-making context in Gig Harbor. So our top question is what questions do you have from the draft report? And then also it's helpful if there's anything in particular that stands out to you. The next question is basically what's missing. Right now we're at the opportunity, we're looking at sort of agnostically across all the 8 UGAs. What is something more that you'd want to know about all of them as you look at the comparisons? And then the third question is actually informing our next deliverable, which is sort of kind of an evaluation matrix of a proposed annexation. And we're drawing here on your guidance and advice on what the council should prioritize in considering when looking at potential annexations. So those are kind of our discussion questions that we're going to get to after Andrew walks through the materials that he gave you for this evening. Yeah, and these questions will be presented again, so you don't have to memorize them. All right, thank you, Andrew.
Yeah. So just to remind everyone, so the urban growth areas that are surrounding Gig Harbor are nominally parts of Pierce County, but they're identified as areas that could be annexed and managed by the city in the future. And these are areas that are targeted for likely future, a lot of them are currently developed out, but they're identified as being sort of areas for urban growth and development that would be appropriate to integrate within the city. And you know, as we had talked about before, I mean, what we're attempting to provide as part of this project is future guidance. So not necessarily evaluating current proposals. There isn't anything that's currently in front of council right now, but more, you know, what does the council need to take a look at in the future when making decisions regarding future annexations? So as part of the study, so this is a map that we have, it's included in the packet as well, just showing showing some subdivisions of the current UGAs of Gig Harbor. And what we're looking to provide as part of the final report, which will expand upon the materials that were provided in the packet, would be an evaluation of current conditions in the UGAs, you know, population, levels of development, land use, vacant lands that are available for future development. And one key analysis is looking at the fiscal impacts of annexation. So if the city were to take on part or all of these areas, what would be the changes in revenue from property taxes and sales and use taxes in these locations? And then what would also be the required investment and services that would be required? So what would be the ongoing costs of maintaining the roads in these areas? What would be the costs for expanding city staff to accommodate additional needs from more residents? What would be the increased costs of hiring more police to patrol these areas? But we also want to recognize here that those aren't the only impacts of annexation. Those aren't the only considerations that would need to be involved. So for example, you know, looking at incorporating certain areas and you know, allowing them to have a greater voice in the investments that are going on in certain areas of the city, for example, maybe one consideration. that's part of our discussion for today, just understanding from you what you see as being some of those other impacts and what you see as being important. Then finally, drawing from that, we do want to get just some recommended guidelines for annexation. And we will cover some examples that we have put in the packet that do highlight how a few other jurisdictions have done this. And I've done this for one or two other communities outside of Washington State, and I could certainly discuss those as well. So some of this material I know that that Carl had discussed in the previous meeting, just looking at annexation and some of the reasons for annexation. Primarily when we're looking at it, the city would be interested in annexing certain areas to provide for increased planning and management of these areas, as a lot of the planning is currently under the purview of Pierce County. Looking at potential opportunities for increased revenue and bonding capacity. Typically cities, you know, that's not always the key reason for annexation, but it's something that can come up. There is also an interest in kind of servicing some areas with increased levels of service. But on the other hand, while you know, there are certain positives, like we had said before, there are also costs that are associated with this as well, that do need to be kept in mind and do need to be planned for in the future if these areas are going to be examined in the long term for integration into the city. So there are a number of methods to that annexation can unfold. Typically, in a lot of cases, it's done through direct petition. There are opportunities for special elections to happen in certain neighborhoods, but typically the petition is used more because of the cost of running an election. There are certain cases where public lands can be annexed through interlocal agreements. And there are some other processes for dealing with annexations of small areas or areas that may just be there are other special cases that may occur. However, typically when we're looking at this, the direct petition method is important to understand, because if you do get a number of residents in, say, the Reed Road area that would provide a petition to council, council needs to respond to that. And it's typical that, in some cases, cities would conduct an individual study of an annexation area as part of an expected annexation in the future or in response to a petition. So what we're proposing as part of this process is almost taking a proactive step and providing some guidance so that in the future, if one of these petitions were to come up, that there would be a consistent response that the City Council would be able to pursue with that. So when we're thinking about this decision making, though, there are cases where it is just a decision as to whether the city should move forward or not move forward. But there are also cases where the city may ask for changes to a proposed annexation that's delivered through petition. So there may be additional conditions where the boundaries could be changed, especially if for some reason the boundaries may be irregular or result in islands of result in unusual shapes with boundaries. But there may also be the desire to pursue additional planning in these areas or some conditions for annexation. Primarily, this would be if you're annexing, a great example would be if you're annexing an area like around Purdy, where there is some commercial development in that area. According to current policy, if areas are annexed into the city right now, they come in under R1 zoning. So if zoning were to change, or if different zoning were to be required, that would be one condition that may be put in place. There may also, as I mentioned, be cases where annexations would be pursued by the city. And in those cases, there is a need to understand in what situations would the city look to pursue annexation, and would there be additional planning necessary? So I'm going to stop for a second just in case anybody has any questions, or I can dive right back into it if that's okay. Seeing no hands or no arms being moved around. So in thinking about how we arrange these annexation guidelines, what we're doing right now is looking at, so this is just a general flow chart right now. And this is our thinking about how we would proceed. What we're looking to do is in the dark blue boxes to the left, looking at just profiles of the urban growth areas, and then what some of the local priorities and considerations would be. And what we'd look to develop as part of this would be the annexation guidelines and the assessment of impacts. So that as we're moving forward with future decision making, both of those elements of the deliverables can help to guide annexation decisions. So I'm just going to just go to the next slide here. So I've already mentioned just some of the thinking regarding the development of annexation guidelines, looking at how we would be developing out these profiles. We can go into that in a moment, and what should be considered. And like we had gone over before, when we're talking about annexation, fiscal impacts are going to be the largest component of that. Looking at property sales and utility taxes, looking at costs with increases in city services, additional infrastructure investment, and infrastructure maintenance. One thing that I should note here is that the analysis that we're doing right now, we're not incorporating a detailed engineering study, for example. So one of the considerations that we have is that, for example, Purdy has a number of drainage issues associated with stormwater management. We're not necessarily going through and doing a detailed costing of the infrastructure in those areas. That's something for a later engineering study that would be pretty significant. What we're looking to do as part of this study, though, is to outline some of those potential obstacles. So while we would be providing estimates, and again, we'll go into that later in the presentation, but while we would be providing some estimates of the fiscal impacts, to city operating budgets, in terms of some of the infrastructure that would be necessary, we want to highlight them, but not necessarily price it out so that we're, coming up with all the possible details. Some of that is going to be, dependent on future development in these areas. Some of it's going to be dependent on, some of the potential planning that would be going on. So as part of the study, not only do we want to look at the current fiscal impacts if these areas were annexed today, but we also want to understand, and this will be incorporated later in our assessment, it's not included in your packet right now, but what we're looking at right now is also examining growth in revenue. So determining what would happen if some of these areas were built out according to the growth targets that have been identified for these UGAs by Pierce County. So if the expected amount of target, housing and job growth were to occur in these areas, what would be those effects as well on city revenue and city costs? So we don't just want to examine what the effects would be today, but what would be the effects over the next 20 years. Certain areas would be the location for a lot more housing growth. What would be the effect to the city and city finances? So, however, as I said, those aren't the only considerations that we need to make here. What we're also looking at is things like minimum size and contiguity. Would there be considerations that need to be made for how big of an area should be annexed? How contiguous would they need to be with city boundaries for it to make sense? Looking at levels of service for elements like police protection and parks, whether there are any considerations in these areas for additional park service. Looking at road management and road management considerations, whether there's whether there are any considerations that need to be made in terms of taking on additional roadways for ongoing preservation and maintenance. Oh, sorry. Okay. One of the other big ones, and something that I think that we need to discuss with you in a little more detail, is looking at coordinated growth management. So as I said, one of the things that's likely to go on in these areas into the future is ongoing commercial and residential development. However, thinking about what the city might want to do with respect to natural areas protection, like shoreline, for example, that may be something to consider as part of these guidelines. Something else, and I hope that this isn't a touchy topic for any golfers on the commission, but one trend that we're seeing in the area is that in places like Bothell and Pacific, there are golf courses that are closing down. So I would imagine that in an integrated, in a community like Canterwood, where the country club is integrated with the development, and it's a private facility, whether or not that would occur, I'm not quite sure of that. But if the commission would believe, for example, that in the future there would need to be some planning around Madrona Links, and if there's a need to kind of think long range about planning in that area for future uses, that may be a question. And finally, and this is something that's covered under some of the examples that I'll get into in a minute, but just looking at phasing. So obviously, a lot of these areas, as their UGAs, are thought of as areas where the city would expand into the future. However, it's obvious that the city is not going to take all of these areas in all at once. What would be some of the considerations that the city would need to make in terms of how much to space out certain annexations, what considerations would need to be made in terms of size and frequency, for example. So there are two examples that we had provided to you. Typically in Washington State, in our experience, there are a lot of annexations that are where councils are more reactive to, where a petition will come in and it'll be evaluated on the basis of comprehensive plan policies and an analysis just for that particular annexation. Oh, and I went backwards. However, one example that we have here is the city of Bellingham was looking in 2018 at a phasing strategy to manage future annexations. So this kind of shifted the preference from the city away from just responding to petitions to having a bit more of a proactive response and looking at facilitating annexations in cases where they could plan for servicing and improvements, identify and take advantage of opportunities to provide additional jobs and housing, and then fulfill some of the long-term planning vision that they would likely need for some areas on the east side some of the residential neighborhoods. So just essentially presenting a clear vision for what the city would expect annexation to look like in the future. Now, this particular example provides a good list of some criteria that they thought of. So looking, for example, at areas that were already at urban densities, locations that would have the potential for future population and job growth, whether or not these areas would be able to be serviced with water, wastewater, roadways, locations that were on key transportation or open space corridors, critical areas, and then just logical boundaries and whether there was local support. And so a lot of these criteria are, some examples we can think of as we're going through this, because as I said, it's not simply just looking at the fiscal impacts of a lot of these, but it's also what are some of the other, how can annexations also fulfill other policies that the city may have. So there is another example. I mean, obviously Ferndale is a little bit different of a case. In this situation, it was a little bit more in terms of phasing out annexation so that they could accommodate areas that were developed and were serviced over time and focus on those areas before areas that would be harder to service. Now, this is an interesting case with Gig Harbor because of the presence of private water utilities, for example. Gig Harbor doesn't have some of the same considerations for servicing that other communities would have. And that's important to consider here, where, in other communities, the extension of water out beyond city boundaries is often a concern, and determining annexations around those servicing plans can often be a consideration. So just really briefly, I do have some maps here just looking at the UGAs. And I can provide some preliminary comments that we have, but I think I'm just going to go through them really quickly, and then we can get to the discussion questions. So we do have maps in the packet just of current zoning, both by the city and current Pierce County zoning for the UGAs. This is something that we need to keep in mind, as I said before, because one of the policies that the city has is that by default, annexation areas will come in at R1 zoning. So, but there is also in the comprehensive plan, land use designations that are separate, that do identify how, what the land use designations under the comprehensive plan will be if these areas are annexed. For most of these areas, it's not necessarily a consideration. There's a small area that's residential medium in Peacock Hill, but it's primarily focused on the high school and the elementary school in Purdy, as well as some of the commercial uses and the utility use up there. But in looking a little bit more in depth, I will just go through these really quickly. We've divided them up on the basis of their general location and some of the land uses. And with Purdy, that really has the primary amount of undeveloped land for non-residential uses. There's a little bit to the south of the city in Point Fosdick that we'll get into in a minute, but Purdy also has two of the major institutional uses in the area with Peninsula High School and Purdy Elementary School. One of the largest areas that we have is obviously Canterwood, and that's dominated by the development there around the Golf and Country Club. But Peacock Hill to the east. That's somewhat of a long area consisting of a number of divisions there. You will please forgive me if I butcher the name slightly. My Slavic pronunciation is a little off, but if somebody would please help me out with this. Thank you. Thank you. So obviously that's dominated by the Washington Correction Center for Women and McCormick Forest Park. So this is a case where this particular UGA is heavily dominated by institutional uses and not necessarily by developable land, although there is some commercial use just to the southeast of the correction center. And then Burnham Drive there, there is a commercial use in the northern part of it, but it's relatively small. We do have 3 individual blocks to the southwest, looking at Rosedale, Scansey, and the 38th Street subareas. Primarily residential. There is a religious use in 38th Street, and there are some small uses that are included in some of these areas, but it's primarily residential. And then to the southeast, we're looking at Reed Road as being one of the larger sub-areas, as well as Madrona Links and Point Fosdick. And with Point Fosdick, one of the interesting parts is that small notch is area that in Pierce County is zoned for to allow for commercial development. So that is one other area where commercial development could take place right now. So hopefully as the discussion goes forward, these maps can be useful. It would be great to point out certain areas that you may be interested in, but I'm just going to move to the discussion questions right now and turn it back over to Dawn for a bit of facilitation and discussion. So thanks. And I am really dark. I just noticed that. I'm so sorry.
The sun set earlier over here in Seattle than it did in Gig Harbor on Andrew.
Yeah, I swear I don't have a dark cloud following me around.
So just to start, the first question really addresses kind of your reactions or questions or thoughts about the draft material. Does anybody want to get us started with questions about what you read there?
This is John Krozik. I have a number of questions and comments on the report. First of all, with respect to the Canterwood area, I was reviewing the costs and the revenues on Canterwood, and I believe that the costs of annexing Canterwood are grossly overstated. Canterwood is primarily a very large private development. All the roads within Canterwood are private. The storm drainage system is private. The sewer systems are private. I think it's mostly septic, and it has its own basic security force. You can't enter Canterwood if you are not a resident or a member of Canterwood Country Club without an invitation. You have to go through a security booth. So I'm kind of scratching my head and figuring how could we possibly have over $1 million in projected costs in terms of annexing that area of our UGA with all those improvements that are already in place there. The second area that I wanted to talk about is the city is incurring costs as a result of development that the county is approving. So what happens, particularly in the area of Peacock Hill, and I'm going to comment mostly on North Gig Harbor because that's the area I'm most familiar with. But when they're putting in these developments in Peacock Hill, that is increasing traffic pressure in the roads that serve the Harbor Hill area and clogging up our traffic circles. And my third point is that the county's development standards are inferior to the city's. with respect to environmental issues. And I've seen a number of developments go into the go in the county, both in the Peacock Hill area and along Reed Road, that look nothing like the developments within the city in terms of buffer zones or considerations of environmental impact of the development. They're basically clear cuts to put the development in. None of the trees are preserved, and it's producing poor development, in my opinion. And so the other point I want to make is in the Peacock Hill area, a lot of the subdivisions there are private roads. And I think that needs to be considered with respect to your study in terms of the public work costs. When we're dealing with private roads and private drainage systems, those are costs that the city is not going to incur.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the end of my comments.
Okay, I can respond quickly, and then I can elaborate later through some additional comments. So with respect to looking at private roads, one of the things that we were very particular about is just evaluating the cost of taking on current public roads in Pierce County. So we didn't factor in the costs of taking current private roads. If it is a consideration that certain public roads would be taken over by the city, that would certainly be a separate consideration. But one of the other things that we are looking to identify, though, is the costs that would be necessary if certain roads would be under county standards that would not be acceptable for the city, and what additional infrastructure or change to the roadway would be necessary for that. With respect to Canterwood, one of the considerations we had in here was just looking at the general cost of accommodating additional population with respect to city services. So some of the estimates of costs were related just more to expanding city capacity just to deal with the number of people. There are some changes that we're looking to make. Just with we had a recent phone call with the chief of police, so we are going to refine some elements related to police protection, which before was more related to just looking at population, and we got a better idea from him with respect to the increments that would be necessary for taking on certain areas. If there are other costs, we will go over the costs that we had included, though, for Canterwood, just to check that again, given your concern about that. So.
Thank you, Commissioner Kozak. That's really helpful feedback. I grabbed a number of points I think that can improve the analysis. Any other?
Do you mind if I jump in for a moment?
Oh yeah, please do, Katrina.
As well.
Yeah.
A lot of great points brought up regarding Pierce County and growth in the UGA, and I just would like to take the opportunity to let the commission know that we are looking at a potential urban growth area management agreement with the county that has not been formally agreed upon by the county yet, but we have posed that to our county commissioner and working on a staff level. And essentially what that would do would put together an agreement by which both jurisdictions agree to, and it could look something like the city reviewing projects within the UGA or the county reviewing the projects against city standards. There's also provisions that can be put in to allow for the city to receive TIF funds for projects that are in the UGA that access on city roads. We are actively pursuing that and agree that something needs to be addressed there. So even though that isn't necessarily germane to the annexation question, it is something that we are considering from the city's perspective moving forward in coordination with the county.
We would be able to I think the comment, I think it's potentially gonna be a little bit both. So in cases where potentially there are environmental resources that the city has an interest in preserving to a higher standard than the county allows, that might at least qualitatively figure into the profiles to inform future decision-making. So there is some, that's the purpose of this conversation, is to make sure that we're capturing those values in terms of your long-range planning within kind of these profiles and analysis, even though some of it may be still kind of at that qualitative level. All right, any other thoughts from the commissioners?
Oh, you're muted, Commissioner Brown.
Is there another feedback from the commissioners?
Yes, I have a couple of questions and some comments. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can. Thanks.
Okay. Can you tell me the time frame that we're working on here? When do we expect, or when would be an appropriate time to present recommendations from the commission to the council?
I can say that the general schedule is such where we're going to be working for the next few months on this. I think that depending on the feedback that we receive, that may impact the schedule for the project. But
okay, thank you. The next point is, I was terrifically impressed by the Bellingham document. And I would like to recommend to the commission that we consider creating a document very much like that to go to the council. I thought it was well written, it was logical, it was very thoughtful, it was easy to understand, and a lack of bureaucraties in the language and the content. I'd like to know what role Burke played in creating that document, if any.
That one, we didn't have a role in that one. That was a separate firm. We wanted to provide you with good examples, so we did have another study from Gorst, but we won't take it personally if you like another firm's work.
Well,
Who was it, Andrew?
certainly is no
remember.
criticism of Burke, but I'd be interested in hearing what other commissioners may have thought of that document. The other point I'd like to make is we have some issues facing us in terms of turnover in the mayor's office. We expect a new city manager early next year, I guess. We're going to have some new council members after the election. And I think we ought to be aiming for creating a document that'll be not only of help to the new members of the city government immediately, but will also be a blueprint for future actions. One of the things I especially liked about the Bellingham approach is that they proposed to take an active role in resolving some of these UGAs that have been sitting around for 20 years with no activity. And I think that ought to be part of what we recommend to the council as well. Let's see, there's another point that is, oh yeah, the other point is, one thing that was not in the Bellingham document that I think should be in the Gig Harbor document is an analysis and reflection on the growth that Gig Harbor has achieved in recent years. And that ought to be, I think, a kind of a touchstone for us. I mean, we ought to be really cautious about stimulating additional growth through annexation of UGAs because of the prevalent belief that we maybe had too much growth in recent years. And that may be a different situation than Bellingham was facing. At least I didn't see any mention of that in the Bellingham document. So those are some of the comments I wanted to deliver today.
Thank you, Commissioner Brown. Excuse me. Commissioner Krajicek, did you have a response to Commissioner Brown's or in addition to his comments? Okay, I think Commissioner Krajicek stepped away. Any other comments from the commissioners?
Yeah, I have a question for you. What kind of historical data can you provide with solid numbers with your projections of the balance sheet, and then 2 years later, the actual reality of what those costs and benefits financially exclusively I'm talking about? So in other words, how accurate are your predictions? And I want to know, using hard data, not feel-good language.
Well, the assessments that we're doing are based on budget numbers over the past 5 years. So what we're looking to do is to project them forward on the basis of the additional population and jobs that would be coming in, or housing units and commercial square footage. So in terms of backcasting to kind of illuminate the effects, what we're doing is based on the available budget data. So we're not, I hope that this is not coming forward as any kind of feel-good statement or anything like that. I think the one consideration that we're looking to make as part of this, though, is that we're not doing a full engineering study of all of the public works that would be necessary to improve. There are some elements in the UGAs where the city doesn't have a solid understanding about the full costs of, for example, mitigation of drainage issues into streams. So we can identify and highlight those as potential areas for future evaluation, but we're not necessarily going to get to a specific price tag for those elements.
Well, I don't think I worded my question in a way that you're understanding what I'm pointing it across. I'm not talking about Gig Harbor.
Oh, okay. All right.
I'm talking about historical data from other cities where you or some other consultant went in and say, we project the cost to the city from this UGA action is going to be this, we project the income for the city is going to be this, and we both know that those are just projections. So what I want is some hard data from past history, and the more recent the better, of areas that have been annexed. What were the financial projection implications? And then, 1, 2, 3, 5 years after the annexation, what were the actual numbers?
That is an interesting question then, and I don't know if I've necessarily.
Yeah, I don't think a city's ever asked to pay for that study. They'd have to say, they'd have to commission a separate study 5 years after and parse out all the costs and expenses attributed to the UGA area.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is the availability of hard data that would be specifically related to the annexation when there are a broader set of costs that may change in a city. I mean, we're looking at one component of how things may change over time. But it's an interesting question. Can I get back to you on response to it then? Because I understand where you're coming from with it, and I think it's an important consideration. So
yeah, that'd be great. But I think, as I sit here right now, my recommendation to the council would be, let's do one. Let's see what the projected costs are, the financial implications, and then let's study it 3 years later and see how the numbers actually work.
Commissioner Hoeksma, that could be, something that you could add on to the recommendation once this moves forward to council, that the commission would like to consider that. That's as the consultants mentioned, that would be something that we would have to pay for, obviously. But I think it's a good idea.
And I think it's a good proactive step because, we're providing it on the best available data that's out there, but it could be that there are other considerations that are involved as well. And, yeah, but we'll look into that.
Well, one of the issues that you would have there, Greg, is that it would be difficult to isolate some components of that. Some would be relatively easy. So for example, if there was a public works project in an area, that would be easy to identify that. But on the other hand, the costs of policing or administration or some of the other factors would be very difficult to break out separately. By the way, I lost audio for about 5 minutes, so I missed some of the conversation. So if anybody was directing a question to me, I wasn't ignoring you. I couldn't hear.
You just had your hand raised.
Yeah, we saw that you had your hand raised, and I was wondering if you had a comment that you wanted to make in addition to Commissioner Brown's comments.
No, I was just screaming for help, trying to get the audio back.
Okay, it was a cry for help. Okay.
I have a couple of comments, please.
Okay, let me hear, since we haven't heard, let's hear from Commissioner Soltis, and then we'll come to you, Commissioner Brown.
Okay, I want to commend you guys for attacking the intangible list. That's been kind of a concern of mine because I'm an old finance guy, and I know numbers are numbers, but intangibles could really be a very strong factor, it would seem to me. And I'm thinking, for example, of police response time. If we went to a Gig Harbor police force versus a county police sheriff's force, I suspect that we would have a much improved response time if there was a need for that. I don't know if you can put a price tag on that, but that would certainly be important to some people to have a faster response. And there's other things like that, of course, you know better than I do. But I hope we don't just simply focus on what you can quantify, because there are some things that are important that are harder to put a number on. Secondly, you mentioned a couple of times the engineering projects that you have sort of some notional ideas of for, but nothing specific. It seems to me that if we're trying to do a financial analysis of, what's the plus or minus cost of annexation, that in any given engineering project could swamp the results. If it was like a piece of road or a stormwater management system, that data point could certainly shift the balance of the financial decision one way or the other. So I don't know how much precision you can put on engineering projects in the future, but it seems very important that we at least get as much detail as possible when we present it forward to the council.
Yes, and just to respond to that point, again, this study in particular is a bit different because, like I had said before, some of the infrastructure and engineering projects that would be necessary to integrate, like Canterwood, for example, into the city, don't involve things that other cities would be concerned about, like, integrating the city, integrating certain areas that aren't developed in with the city water system, for example, or, building out new roads. A lot of the areas that are around may need certain improvements in terms of bringing them up to city road standards, but it's not as if there would need to be massive new arterials cut into undeveloped areas. Some of the examples that I was talking about, there may be some high level costs that we can associate with them, and like you said, those capital costs, that's going to overwhelm the smaller kind of operational surplus or deficit that these areas would bring. But again, what we want to do though is to make sure that when we're discussing this, it is about the numbers, but it's also about other considerations as well. You know, are these areas, you know, what would be the potential advantages for the city to be taking on certain projects like that? Are there any environmental quality issues that the city would be better prepared to deal with than the county, for example? So.
Thank you. Commissioner Brown?
Oh, you're muted.
You're still muted, sir.
Follow up to Greg's question. You know, the impression that I get from all the documentation that you provided is that annexation of residential areas is almost always a money loser for a city. And, you know, I think we would really need to stress the benefits to the city of annexing a Peacock Hill or a Canterwood, where there doesn't seem to be potential for commercial development and where the benefits aren't obvious, I guess. And I think that's something that needs to be stressed because, well, I've said what I think. Thank you.
Yeah, and we totally agree. And this is one of the reasons why we wanted to talk with you, to make sure that if there were non-fiscal considerations that you would have, that we would integrate those into what we're putting together.
Commissioner
I would
Freeman?
just want to add that I think that those non-financial considerations are very important. Obviously, whether the city pursues annexation or we're considering an annexation request from an area, there are a lot of considerations beyond just revenues and expenses. So I'm encouraged by those criteria being included in the study.
Thank you. Commissioner, is it Grina or Grina?
Grina.
Grina.
I respond to all of those. So as a certified professional horticulturist, I think one element that really needs to be included here, and a couple of the other commissioners touched on it, you know, where clear cutting and all sorts of things have gone on in some of these areas, you know, the environmental impacts seems to me that should be an important piece of the analysis, looking at some of these areas to be annexed. And I know that's a difficult thing to quantify, but because of all the requirements that the city of Gig Harbor already has, just because by the EPA and everything else, I think we would be remiss not to be making that part of the consideration as well.
What would be some of the environmental attributes of the various areas you think would be important to enumerate?
I mean, there's stormwater runoff, there's tree canopy. Gosh, it's been a long day. But those are all the kinds of things that, you know, wildlife corridors, wetland areas, those type of things. You know, I've seen development be in these outlying areas because the developers didn't need to address those things to the strict requirements that the city has. And frankly, you know, I think they've taken advantage of that. And by annexing those areas, the long-term impacts of those things are going to affect the city. And so that's something that definitely needs to be considered. There's my 2 cents.
You make an excellent point there. And I think one other factor that you might want to throw in there is climate change. As we keep clearing out the forest canopy, we're creating hotter neighborhoods and hotter communities.
I would add a comment that while I agree, I'm personally appalled by clear cutting. There are state UGA guidelines that are pushing higher density developments. I've got one going in down the street from me where the houses are so close together, it is literally impossible to retain any trees. And that is something that in many cases will be beyond the city's control because it's driven by state requirements.
So I'm capturing some notes here about perhaps some of the environmental considerations. And I think when we get to later discussions about things to consider when evaluating a potential annexation area, I just want to look at the time also and highlight, we're kind of moved into it, the second two questions here, and particularly the third one, drawing on your guys' experience as managing kind of the long range planning of the city. What elements should council consider when evaluating an annexation petition? So you're getting at it with some of the environmental things, but any other kind of ideas or concerns to put on the table now?
I think one of the things that I had spoken to in previous meetings and discussing this too, and I'm not sure that I'm seeing it physically in any of these properties, but is there potential for future park space when you talk about retaining trees and the environmental aspect of things, but park space, you know, similar to like what you see with McCormick Forest Park, but also what about open park space, playgrounds, active recreation sort of park space? When you think about bringing in additional neighborhoods and cities, then you have more families and more spaces that are going to be necessary. And is that something that the city would factor in if we're going to take on this many more residential elements within the city? Do we need to provide X amount more space for park space, soccer fields, what have you, stuff like that, that would also service those residences that now that they're part of the city with? I would be curious if there are. I see some spaces that it seems might be possible in some of the northern, but some of the areas that are heavily residential right now, I can see that that's just not a possibility.
Yeah. Oh, Katrina, please say.
Oh, I can see what Commissioner Bennett was saying relating to the LOS standards within our PROS plan, the Parks Recreation Open Space Plan, that requires a certain amount of playgrounds per person, and there's a requirement for a certain amount of open space per capita as well. So I think that could be quantified.
Yeah. And I think, you know, one other thing to just note is that we're not necessarily looking to plan out where the parks would be going in the future. But one thing that we can do, though, is to do a cursory analysis just to kind of highlight what you're saying, that there are certain neighborhoods where park space could be possible. There are others where, you know, that would be a little bit more challenging. Something else to consider is that, you know, one of the areas outside of the city has a large park associated with the Peninsula District, so the Peninsula Park District. So that's something else we also need to consider with that. But
along those lines, Andrew, I can see, for instance, Reed Road, that big swath, if the city were to take that in, that would be a lot of residents, for instance, and there is no current park within that area. And so I think that may be at least if I'm following what Commissioner Bennett was saying, kind of a potential impact that the city would have to incur.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think on the flip side of that, as development gets pushed into areas that are right now in the UGA, you have more control over the short platting and things to have reserve spaces for parks and sort of that master development planning. So if you want that master development planning to happen when it's within the city, so that you can have that control and maintain those levels of standards of service. Commissioner Brown?
In terms of criteria, I would be happy if we took the 12 or 15 criteria that Bellingham described, discard the ones that don't apply to Gig Harbor, if there are any like that, then add some additional ones, as I suggested earlier, I think that would be a great place to start. And be interested in your opinion as using that as a model.
One of the reasons why we included it in there, I think, like I said, there are a few other projects like this that I've been involved with, and that clearly lays out a set of criteria, and I think that that's what's needed here. So yeah, that's a good basis. So.
All right, so we've touched a lot on kind of about environmental concerns, where development UGAs impact things within the city boundaries, a couple other kind of the non-financial considerations to include. As you guys think about how you would evaluate potential annexation proposals, are there any other kind of big categories or specific topics or anything idiosyncratic of a particular UGA that you think we need to at least mention qualitatively as we sort of do the next kind of more full out version of this analysis? And I see Commissioner Krazik.
Yeah, Don, my question there would be what kinds of things have you run into in other communities when you've done this study? So in addition to the financial and the environmental and the parks issues and the transportation issues, what else have you seen come up?
The dominant element in a lot of other cities has to do with servicing, because it's the phasing of servicing that determines a lot of growth in UGAs in other communities. Aside from that, you know, in terms of preference, a lot of it we've already covered. It's looking at, you know, some communities often look at areas that they can annex for additional revenue growth opportunities. So looking at opportunities to bring jobs into the community. There are certain strategic annexations that communities make for areas that they expect would grow, and if they would prefer to plan these areas on their own as opposed to letting a county plan a lower density development or a development that they think wouldn't necessarily be of higher quality. You know, that sometimes communities do identify priority annexations in that way. Aside from that, I'm trying to think of any others. In many cases, like I said before, some cities are reactive. Some cities respond more to the applications that come in and evaluate them on a case-by-case basis, and don't necessarily look as far ahead as I think that these guidelines are going to be trying to look. So I hate to say that there isn't anything else, but I think that we've covered the big points. But Dawn,
I was just going to say, a lot of times, I mean, this is a very sort of proactive analysis because we're looking at all the UGAs at once and trying to build some way to like think about them in terms of the respective variables. A lot of times we're looking at the impacts of a specific annexation. And so the conversation that we're involved in is kind of like phasing within a particular area. And so strategies might be annexing in the nodal neighborhood commercial first, and then subsequently annexing in the rest of the residential, just to sort of offset the fiscal impacts. So you have a couple of years of those sales tax revenues before you pull in the rest of the residential. So it's rare that it's not as often that we're looking at all the UGAs at once and kind of doing an analysis in that respect.
That kind of, your last 2 points, both of you, kind of segues into my request. What I would like to have you deliver to us is, I mean, you guys do this for a living. You know, we're community volunteers here trying to understand this, you know, complex process, and certainly you've helped a ton, as for me anyway. But I would like to see you all take all of these areas and give us your opinion of the list. Do this one first, and this one, this one, this one, this one, and maybe some bullet points of why you feel that way. Especially if we are going to be proactive instead of passive or reactive, or recommending to the council that they take a proactive approach to this as opposed to reactive. So, because I don't feel, even after what you've told us now, I have no idea. Do we consider Canterwood first? Do we consider Madrona and the golf course first? Reed Road? I don't have any idea.
Yeah.
And I'd like to have your opinion.
Well, and I think that that's fair. And I think that part of the reason why we wanted to have this meeting is to understand if there were any other considerations we need to factor into that kind of advice. So, yeah, but that's a good point.
Katrina, I see your hand is up.
Thanks, John. Before I say what I was going to say, just to address Commissioner Hoeksema, I think 100% we wanted to get the commission's feedback on this before any recommendations are put out. You are community volunteers, but you are the commission that's that we want to hear the feedback from as our community representatives. And no offense to Burke being from Seattle, but we do hear that, they don't live here in Gig Harbor, and you all do. And so we kind of wanted to hear, are we missing something, or are we getting a lot of feedback about a specific topic, and help us kind of prioritize that before we put something out that says, this is what we think. So, that may come down the line at the next meeting or meeting from now, but definitely wanted to hear feedback from the commission before putting that out. Although I do definitely see where you're coming from about not being the experts, and that we're paying Burke as the experts in this, which is great. The reason I raised my hand is I really agree with Commissioner Brown, not that I'm on the commission, but I do really like the Bellingham criteria. They look pretty complete to me. And one that stood out that I just wanted to call attention to for the commission's consideration is the creation of logical boundaries and service areas. From a planning perspective, in particular, if we look at the one on Scansey Road, as well as the Busage, Oregon, or Burnham, excuse me. For instance, the properties that are to the east of Burnham that have Highway 16 to the west, they are surrounded 100% by city. And so for the county sheriff and the county inspectors that are having to come out, it's not logical at all. So from a purely GMA planning perspective, something that we think is pretty important is the creation of logical boundaries, so that the jurisdictions can then plan for their staff, so that the building inspectors, there's a funny joke that kind of goes around here is our inspectors go to like the courtyards at Scansey on Hunt and Scansey, and then kitty corner, you see the building inspectors from the county going over to the ones that are just down the road off of Scansey. And so that provision of service and logical boundary is kind of a tenet of the GMA. And so that would be something I would want to call to the commission's attention.
Thank you, Katrina. And then Commissioner Brown.
Just a couple more points. In terms of presenting this, I think we need to look at the context of where Gig Harbor is at this time. We have to look at population growth, actual population growth against the plan. We need to look at job growth or employment growth against the plan. And there needs to be kind of a context that we approach these annexation issues in. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, and I think that I mean what we provided for discussion as part of the packet of materials for this meeting is not intended to be a draft of the full document that we're going to produce. So I think that adding that in about the context makes a lot of sense. So, yep. And providing that context is very appropriate, especially when looking at hitting housing and population targets. So,
Andrew, with that, do we have something in, or will we have in the report now that the buildable lands analysis has been finalized for Pierce County, you know, potential consideration for criteria to be the capacity within those areas for population and employment, and what impact that would have coming into the city? I think that's kind of something along what Commissioner Brown's talking about.
yes. Now, we need to be a little bit careful in this because one thing that we need to make clear is that we're not looking to do additional planning for the areas within the UGA. So it would be an extra exercise to say, come up with a completely new zoning, designations for everywhere in, you know, the Reed Road area, for example. But what we'd be looking to do is to evaluate that development capacity on the basis of the current buildable lands work, which is tied in with the current county zoning, and evaluate how much more housing can go in these areas. And then as well with our future, with our look into the future, you know, given the county's housing and jobs targets for these UGAs, what would be the likely, like how much of that capacity would just be taken up by the growth that the county is estimating for these areas right now. So we do want to include that as considerations in here.
Commissioner Krasik?
Oh,
I'm sorry, sir, you're muted. Yeah.
Okay, here we go. Katrina, you raised the issue of these areas that might actually be surrounded or mostly surrounded by the city. And most cities and counties have mutual aid agreements with respect to emergency services. And I'm wondering if maybe one of the things we ought to be considering is how often do our police officers respond to calls in the county, in the unincorporated areas, in some of these parts that we're looking at. Because I think maybe we might be picking up some of the costs that the sheriff, that are really attributable to the sheriff's office. And I'm wondering if it's possible to get from the police department any statistics on those calls.
Yeah, so we have talked with the police chief, and we do have information that wasn't included in your packet. It was, we had scheduled the meeting after we had sent that out. But one thing that he made a point to make is that the relationship that the Gig Harbor Police Department has with the Pierce County Sheriff is very good, and they do provide mutual aid in both ways. That there are cases where the sheriff will respond in certain cases to, you know, calls in Gig Harbor and vice versa. We'll be providing more information like that as part of the final report, and getting a little bit more of an indication about, you know, what the volume of calls have been in certain areas and how that would be related to costs for additional policing. So.
Okay, that'd be great. I'd really like to see that. Thank you.
Commissioner Hoeksema, are you, you're on mute, but I can see your mouth moving.
I was asking Andrew to turn off the screen sharing so we can see everybody again.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's a great point.
Thank you.
All right. Any other comments or notes from the group? I think we've heard from everybody to some degree. Maybe not. I think we've heard from all the commissioners. Any other thoughts or direction for us as we advance this to the next phase of work? All right. Not
So
hearing.
I do have one question and then one kind of closing remark, I guess. There are certain larger land uses and facilities we've identified, in our initial pass, looking at the elementary and high schools up in Purdy, and looking at Madrona Links. Would anyone say that these are particular areas that we should be treating a little separately in terms of whether or not they should be annexed? I mean, are there?
I agree with that point. I did not see any particular benefit to annexing either of those areas anytime in the near future.
Oh, Commissioner Soltis,
Soltis, I think you're muted.
Sorry, the Women's Correctional Facility kind of made me scratch my head a little bit. It's a public facility. We don't get any tax revenue from it, I assume. And I'm not really seeing any advantage there at all of taking that under our wing, if you will. But I guess the state set the UGAs.
Yeah, and it's also related to, as Katrina was saying, the logical boundaries that the city would have. I mean, there is some small commercial developments in those areas, and there are some policing considerations as well, but yeah.
With regard to that portion of that particular UGA, one of the previous planners here had talked about eliminating McCormick Forest from the UGA, that amount of acreage, just noting that there's no development capacity. It's a park, Penn Met Park, who serves unincorporated Pierce County. And so would it make sense to, through the next comp plan update, remove that park, the large parkland, out of the UGA and move it into unincorporated? I don't know if we would get there with the women's prison because it is served by sewer, but definitely the park there, that could be a consideration in the next comp plan update to remove that from the UGA.
Okay. Well, Andrew, I'll go ahead and invite you to make any closing comments that might inspire a few more comments from the commissioners. We'll see.
I'll do my best, Braveheart. The only other thing that I would say is, we really do appreciate your input. We appreciate your time tonight. And if there's anything else that you can think of, any other comments that you would have, please, by all means, let Katrina and Carl know. We're looking at fleshing out the full report and providing a preliminary set of guidelines. And any more input that you can provide on that, we would really appreciate it. So,
Andrew and Don, I want to thank you for your work and thank the staff and the other commissioners for a really interesting discussion tonight.
thank you.
Thank you.
So we will bring this back to you once we have the work product further along, as Andrew and Don have said. I just want to echo their remarks to all of you. This has been very fruitful, and it's kind of an exciting thing to bring forward, especially since it's not something that is required of us. It's something that the city wants to do proactively in order to figure out how we're going to, look at annexations over the next 10, 20 years. So it's kind of nice sometimes to work on something that's proactive instead of reactive. And I really appreciate the commissioners' responses to this. Very helpful. And thank you, Andrew and Don.
Okay. Well, we appreciate it. And Katrina, I especially appreciate your point of wanting to get our input, before the professionals from the Great White North impose their opinion on us. And so point well taken, and appreciate the discussion with all the commissioners this evening. So, all right. Well, next item on the agenda is other business. Our next meeting is scheduled for Thursday, October 21st. Do you need to say anything more about that? We discussed that a little bit at the beginning of the meeting, Katrina. You know, with the first presentation, is there anything else that, you know, that the fact that it's going to be the open public hearing for the comp plan amendment for arts and culture?
No, Carl will reach out to you before that and establish the structure with you so that you're able to run the hearing, and we will have gone over that. It'll be very similar to what I mentioned, staff presentation, the applicants can give a presentation, public testimony, and then you know, debate amongst commissioners and clarifying questions. If there is one more moment before we leave, I would like to make 1 or 2 announcements to the commission.
Okay, sure.
Commissioner Krausik, did you have something before I say?
I just wanted to ask, will that meeting with the public hearing begin at 6 o'clock?
Yes.
Thank you.
Michelle nodded, so she's on top of that stuff.
Okay.
Just very briefly, I wanted to let the commission know that you may have seen this in the newspaper or read about it on Facebook, but the city council did enact a moratorium on short-term rentals at their last meeting. They will be conducting a public hearing on Monday, the 11th. And as part of that action, staff is recommending that they direct the work of that to the Planning Commission. So I wanted you to know that staff is recommending that come to the commission for your review and recommendation. Additionally, there was a bill that was passed in the state in May that requires all cities to allow for transitional housing and emergency shelters within all cities within Washington state. The city council did pass interim zoning controls at their last meeting, and there will be a public hearing for that as well on the 11th. If you're interested in those, the council bills and presentations can be found online. But essentially, if we did not enact interim zoning controls, the state law would have taken control, and they transitional housing and emergency shelters would have been permitted outright without benefit of additional controls within the zoning code. Staff did put together those, put new sections on an interim basis into our code to require conditions for all of those uses, as well as made them conditional use permits, needing to get conditional use permits for those uses that are required now by state law. Those are again interim for a period of 6 months. The public hearing will be on Monday, and we've also asked City Council to direct that work to the Planning Commission to review what has been proposed and to make any necessary amendments before going back to Council before the end of February of next year. So if you hear about those work program items that are going to be coming to you, I didn't want you to be blindsided by that fact. The moratorium came about very quickly, and there was not a lot of time to communicate that with anyone. So just wanted to let you know that, you know, we have heard the commission's desires to be more included on planning matters, and staff again is recommending that both of those work items will come to the commission for your review. That was all. And Carl will be back next time. So
yeah. Hey, could you just clarify for me, Katrina, because I read that stuff about the moratorium. I read the moratorium, and despite reading it 3 or 4 or 5 times, the short-term lodging, does that refer? It seemed to refer to only a place that was renting out more than 3 rooms per night, and didn't seem to include someone that might use their home as just 1 bedroom rented out as an Airbnb. Did I read that correctly?
it's for all lodging level 1 uses. So that would be anything that is a short-term rental, whether it's a boat, a single bedroom, a single family residence, for instance. It would not be, for instance, larger bed and breakfasts or boutique hotels or hotels. The city's code currently is not set up to address those uses separately. So for instance, there's some that feel that an owner occupied structure should be an approved use, whereas if it's a standalone single family residence that's being rented out, that should be held to the conditional use permit standards. Right now, our code kind of holds them all to the same standard. And so through this process, what we hope to do is look at the use, break it down further, get recommendations from the commission and feedback from the public, and address it as necessary within our code. But right now, our code is, quite frankly, a little bit out of date. And I think most cities' codes are. You know, VBRO, Airbnb, they've become very popular within the past maybe 8 years, and especially during the pandemic. And so there's several communities that you may have heard about in the news, such as Leavenworth, Stillicum across the water from us, for instance, just banned them and gave the owner 6 months to figure out how to make it work. For some of the more neighborhood considerations that these can be problems for. But our code, we really need to have to look at it and break out the different kind of levels of lodging level 1, potentially call them different things, and have it be not only more streamlined process for the public, but also more understandable process for staff as well.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Well, good discussion today, long meeting. So barring any other input, I'm willing to entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
And the second,
I second that.
Second.
all those in favor of adjourning, say aye.
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 And that sounds like a unanimous approval. So it is 7:17 p.m. and I am closing the meeting of the Planning Commission.
Thank you.